Identity is supposed to feel stable. You memorize your number, sign your name, confirm your address, answer the security questions, and move through ordinary systems with the quiet assumption that your life belongs to you. That is what makes certain identity theft stories so disturbing. Not because they begin with obvious danger, but because they begin with ordinary conditions. A routine phone call, a trip to a dealership, a badge scan at work, a piece of mail, a flagged account, a question from someone behind a desk, and then shift without warning into something the mind cannot explain fast enough. A dead child's name appears on an adult corpse. A first credit check comes back stained with debts that are not yours. A secure door refuses to open, and suddenly your entire life is under review. And the worst part is how the brain tries to fix it in real time. It tells you the records got crossed. The clerk pulled the wrong file. The report is outdated. The system needs to refresh. Someone typed a number in wrong. The account will clear once a real person looks at it. The name only came back because of some small administrative error. Because the truth is harder to accept. That someone can step into your life without ever meeting you. That a name can be stolen long before you know it is vulnerable. And that, once the wrong version of you enters the system, it may be believed faster than the real one. Tonight's stories follow three people whose lives are altered by identities that no longer belong only to them. Elaine Simmons, in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, who is contacted by police in 2024 and told that a deceased man has been identified as her son, Daniel, a child who actually died in 1984, forcing her and her husband to confront the unbearable reality that someone else built an entire adulthood under their dead son's name. Stephen Harris, in Dayton, Ohio, whose first attempt to buy a car turns into a months-long unraveling when he discovers that loans, credit cards, and even a repossessed vehicle have already been attached to his identity before he ever had the chance to begin adult life on his own terms. And Cam Sanders, in Quantico, Virginia, whose high-security forensic career begins collapsing in a single morning when her badge is denied, her clearance is suspended, and she learns that a woman arrested in another state has been living under her identity long enough for the system to react before anyone listens. Because the most disturbing identity theft horror stories are not always about money. Sometimes they are about grief being reopened by paperwork. Sometimes they are about watching your future get damaged before it begins. And sometimes they start with one routine check, one phone call, or one denied access point, right up until you realize someone else has already been living inside your name. Tonight, these are three identity theft horror stories, and all three begin with a system saying, the wrong person is you. Story 1. He died in 1984. My name is Elaine Simmons, and for most of my life, I believed there were certain things the world had enough decency to leave alone. A grave, for one. A child, for another. My husband Thomas and I learned in the summer of 1984 that the world did not care what we thought it should leave untouched. Our son Daniel was 9 years old when he died. He had a cowlick he could never flatten, skinny wrists, and a habit of asking questions long after most children would have stopped listening for the answer. We lived outside Lancaster then, in a farmhouse that had been in Thomas's family for 2 generations, surrounded by fields that looked beautiful from the road and dangerous up close. Every year, when the corn got tall and the machinery came out, I would tell Daniel not to wander near the equipment. I told him enough times that I believed repetition alone could protect him. It could not. There are details of that day I have forgotten, maybe mercifully, and others I remember with such clarity that it feels like memory hardened into something physical inside me. The heat, the smell of oil, and dry hay. Thomas shouting before I knew what he was shouting about. The sudden stillness afterward, the kind that swallows a place whole. Daniel's death was ruled an accident, which is the coldest word in the English language when it is attached to a child. We buried him 3 days later at the small cemetery behind St. Luke's, under a maple tree that was still young enough then not to throw much shade. People tell you grief changes shape with time. They say it softens. It becomes easier to carry. I do not know if that is true. I only know it becomes quieter. It learns the house. It knows where to sit. By October of 2024, I was 68 years old. Thomas was 71. We had built a life around the absence. We had no other children. Daniel had been our only one. Over the years, his room became a guest room, then a storage room. Then, after Thomas's knee started troubling him, the place we kept, all the things we did not want to throw away but no longer had the strength to sort through. His baseball glove was still in there somewhere, his school picture from second grade, a shoebox with the hospital bracelet from the day he was born, because I was the kind of mother who kept things that small. The call came on a Thursday morning, while I was wiping down the kitchen counters. I almost let it go to voicemail because I did not recognize the number. Lately, if a number was unfamiliar, it was usually somebody trying to sell me supplemental insurance or tell me my Medicare card had been compromised. But something made me answer. A habit, maybe. At my age, you begin to think an unanswered call might always be the one you should have taken. "This is Elaine Simmons," I said. The man on the line introduced himself as Trooper Adam Keller with the Pennsylvania State Police. His voice was professional in the way that police voices often are, careful and flat, as if he had been taught how to remove every unnecessary human edge from what he said. He asked if I was the mother of Daniel Simmons. I remember smiling before I understood why he was asking. I said, "I am." Then he said, "Mrs. Simmons, I'm sorry to inform you that a deceased adult male was found outside Harrisburg this morning carrying identification in that name." I did not understand him at first. I heard the words, but my mind refused to fit them together. He went on speaking, and I interrupted him. "No," I said. There was a pause. "No," I said again, louder this time. "That can't be right. My son is dead." He did not say anything for a second, and in that second, I understood that he thought I was in denial, that he thought I was an elderly woman, hearing terrible news and refusing to accept it. "My son died in 1984, I told him. He was 9 years old. I heard paper move on his end, or maybe a keyboard. His tone changed, just slightly. "Mrs. Simmons," he said, "our records indicate the deceased male was in possession of a Pennsylvania driver's license identifying him as Daniel R. Simmons, date of birth, the 17th of June, 1975. That was Daniel's birthday." For a moment, I could not breathe. I sat down at the kitchen table because my legs had become useless under me. The chair scraped hard against the floor. Thomas was in the mudroom sorting through a coffee can of screws and nails, and he called out to ask who it was. I could not answer him. "I need you to listen to me," I told the trooper. "My son Daniel never had a driver's license. He never grew up. He died when he was 9. We buried him in Lancaster County. If someone is dead using his name, then that is not my son." Those last 3 words came out wrong. Not my son. As if there was any danger, any possibility that it might be. The trooper asked me several questions after that. Where Daniel had died, whether we still had his death certificate, whether his social security number could have been compromised, whether we had ever experienced identity theft in the family. I answered as best I could, though there was a roaring in my ears by then that made it difficult to hear my own voice. When the call ended, Thomas came in and took one look at me and knew something had happened. He had aged heavily in the last 10 years. There was a time he looked built out of fence posts and stone, the kind of Pennsylvania farm man who seemed born already weathered. By 2024, his shoulders had rounded some, and his hands shook when he was tired, but his face still changed very little unless he was afraid. Then, all the color would leave it at once. "What is it?" he said. I tried to tell him plainly, but the sentence collapsed halfway through. He stood motionless while I explained, one hand still holding a screw between his fingers. When I finished, he said, "No." It was the same word I had said, for the same useless reason. By that afternoon, we were driving to the state police barracks in Harrisburg, with Daniel's death certificate in a manila folder on the seat between us. I had not touched that certificate in years. The paper was older than some of the officers we met that day. It had our son's name typed neatly across it, along with the date of death, cause of death, the signatures of people who had probably gone home that evening and eaten dinner and slept while our world ended. I remember laying it out on our dining room table before we left, smoothing it flat with both hands. It struck me then that this might be the last official document in the world that still belonged wholly to Daniel. At the barracks, we were shown into a conference room with bad coffee and gray walls. Trooper Keller was younger than I expected, maybe mid-30s, with the look of a man who had spent too long delivering information nobody wanted. Another investigator joined him, a woman named Detective Marisol Vega from Dauphin County. They had already confirmed that the deceased man was not our son in any biological sense, but they needed to understand how he had been using Daniel's identity. The man, they told us, had been found behind a budget motel outside Harrisburg after what appeared to be an overdose. No signs of robbery, no immediate next of kin. The identification in his wallet named him Daniel Simmons. The fingerprint check had been messy. There were records under that name in multiple states over several decades, but enough inconsistencies surfaced that they began looking deeper. When they contacted us, they were expecting confusion. They were not expecting parents whose child had died 40 years earlier. "Do you know anyone who might have had access to your son's personal documents after his death?" Detective Vega asked. I almost laughed at that. Not because it was funny, but because the question felt obscene in its ordinary logic. It treated Daniel like a file cabinet somebody had opened. "We buried him," I said. We were not thinking about people stealing from him. Thomas sat beside me with both hands on his knees. He had gone very still, which was always worse than when he got angry. "What exactly did this man do under our boy's name?" he asked. Neither of them answered immediately. That told me enough. Over the next 2 hours, the shape of the theft began to emerge in pieces. The man had held driver's licenses in Pennsylvania and Ohio. He had worked under Daniel's name at warehouses, machine shops, and construction companies. He had filed taxes. He had been married once, briefly. There were old traffic citations, a domestic disturbance call from the late 90s, an arrest for petty theft in Columbus that had never been fully prosecuted, utility accounts, lease agreements, credit applications. A whole adult life, mediocre and shabby and long, built on top of the bones of our dead child. Every detail felt like a desecration. I kept imagining Daniel at 9 years old, missing his front tooth, knees grass-stained, and then I would hear Detective Vega say something like vehicle registration or employment history, and that image would split in half inside my head. At some point she said, "Mrs. Simmons, Mr. Simmons. I know this is difficult." And Thomas, who had said almost nothing, finally looked up and told her, "You do not." The room went silent. He was not cruel about it. He was simply telling the truth. We went home at dusk. The road back to Lancaster seemed longer than the one there. Cornfields moved past the windows in black rows, and every now and then headlights would sweep over an old barn or mailbox and make it glow for a second before the dark took it back. Neither of us spoke much. At home I took the death certificate back out and put it on the kitchen table again. Then I went upstairs and opened the closet in the room that had once been Daniel's. I did not know why I did it. Some part of me must have needed proof that he had really been small once, that there had been a beginning and an end no stranger could alter. I found the shoebox on the top shelf, dust on the lid, and carried it downstairs. Inside were the little things I had not looked at in years. Hospital bracelet, a yellowed lock of hair from his first haircut, 2 baby teeth wrapped in tissue, a class picture, a plastic sheriff's badge he wore until the pin broke. Thomas sat down across from me as I spread them out. He picked up the class picture and held it close. Daniel was in the second row, smiling as if he had been told not to. All those children in neat little squares, and only one of them had gone on living in government databases and motel registers and arrest files while lying under a headstone the entire time. It was Thomas who said it out loud first. "This son of a bitch studied him." I looked up. "He had the birthday," Thomas said. "The middle initial. Social. That is not luck." And he was right. Identity theft is a phrase people use too casually now. It sounds administrative, annoying, something that gets handled after a few long phone calls. But what happened to Daniel was not some random credit fraud. Whoever took his name had gone looking for a dead child. He had chosen a life that had ended before it could complicate itself with adult records. No mortgage, no military file, no marriage license. Nothing to contradict him if he was careful enough. He had found a blank space where a person should have been, and he moved in. In the weeks that followed, the investigation widened. We met again with Detective Vega, then with an investigator from Ohio after records pointed there. We were asked to verify old addresses, family names, places of employment Thomas had held in the 70s and 80s. They wanted to know whether any newspaper articles had run when Daniel died, whether there had been a funeral home notice, whether the grave was public, whether we had ever noticed paperwork missing after the burial. I started sleeping badly. Thomas started not sleeping at all. There is a cruelty in having your worst day reopened by bureaucracy. Everything has to be documented, clarified, repeated. Our son's death, which we had spent 40 years trying to carry privately, became a case file. His accident was summarized in bland phrases by people born after it happened. We had to order another certified copy of the death certificate because the original was too fragile to keep transporting. I had to call St. Luke's to confirm burial records. I had to hear a clerk ask, gently but without understanding, "And what is the reason for the request?" I said, "Someone stole my dead son's name." The line went quiet after that. About 3 weeks in, Detective Vega called and asked if we could come down one more time. They believed they had identified the deceased man's real name. We met her in a county office instead of the barracks. The room smelled faintly of dust and copier toner. She placed a folder on the table and said the man's probable real identity was Stephen Varga, born in Akron, Ohio, in 1962. He had a history of unstable housing, short-term jobs, and petty arrests under various names. At some point in the early 1990s, Stephen Varga disappeared from the record almost entirely. Not long after, Daniel Simmons appeared as an adult. "There's no indication they ever knew each other," she said carefully. "Our best estimate is that he acquired Daniel's identity through public death records or obituary information." I remember nodding, as if I could absorb that in any useful way. Stephen Varga. I hated the name instantly. Not because there was anything wrong with it, but because it belonged to the man who had looked at my dead child and seen an opportunity. Detective Vega slid a few photocopies toward us. Old license renewals, employment forms, a motel registration card. I stared at the signature line on one document where he had written Daniel Simmons in a rough, slanted hand. I had signed Daniel's report cards in a round, careful script when he was little. Seeing the name written by someone else, over and over, made me feel suddenly sick. Then she told us they had recovered some personal effects from the motel room where he had been staying. Clothing, toiletries, receipts, a duffel bag, and a small cardboard file box. Most of it was ordinary. But because of the connection to our son, they wanted to know whether we would be willing to look at some of the contents before they were entered as evidence copies. I almost said no. Thomas said yes before I could speak. The box was brought in 10 minutes later by another officer wearing gloves. It was not dramatic looking, just a cheap brown file box with a lid caved slightly on one corner from use, the kind people keep old bills in, the kind you might find in the back of a closet. But when the lid came off, the air in the room changed. Inside were documents in hanging folders, arranged almost neatly. One folder contained photocopies of Daniel's death certificate, not one copy but several. Another held printouts of old addresses associated with our family. One contained newspaper clippings, including a brittle photocopy of a local article from 1984 about a child killed in a farm accident. I had forgotten the paper ever ran it. There were photographs, too. Not originals, thank God, but copies. Daniel, at 7, with a fishing pole too big for him. Daniel in his Little League uniform. Daniel standing between Thomas and me in front of our barn, squinting into the sun. My vision blurred so badly, I could barely see the edges of them. And then there was a small spiral notebook. Detective Vega opened it carefully. Most of the entries were practical, written in a cramped hand. Mother, Elaine Mercer. No, Simmons after marriage. Maiden name, Klein. Father, Thomas Simmons. Lancaster address, old and current. School district. Date of death. Church. Cemetery. It went on like that for pages. He had not stolen Daniel casually. He had researched him. He had assembled him. He had taken pieces of my son's life and pinned them down into a usable shape. At the back of the notebook, on one of the last pages, was a line that made something inside me turn cold. Only child, no siblings to challenge. I did not cry in the room. I waited until we got home. I sat at the edge of our bed, with my shoes still on, and for the first time in years I cried the way I had cried in 1984, with no dignity left in it, no thought for how I sounded. Thomas stayed with me, but did not touch me at first. We had learned long ago that grief can make the body feel foreign. After a while, he put his hand on the back of my neck and left it there. For several days after that, I could not stop thinking about the ordinary passages of time Stephen Varga had occupied with my son's name. He had turned 30, as Daniel Simmons, turned 40, maybe 50. He had stood in line at the DMV, opened bank accounts, checked into motels, filled out forms under fluorescent lights in offices that smelled like carpet cleaner and toner and stale heat. And every time he wrote Daniel's name, the world accepted it. Meanwhile, the real Daniel remained 9 forever. I found myself going to the cemetery more often after that. St. Luke sits back from the road behind a stone wall with lichen on it. In October, the ground there is covered in brittle leaves, and the wind always seems louder than it should be. Daniel's headstone is modest. Just his name, dates, and a line from the Psalms Thomas chose because it sounded steadier than anything either of us felt at the time. One afternoon I stood there with my coat buttoned wrong and thought about the decades of paperwork attached to his name, and it seemed impossible that the earth beneath me and the records inside all those filing systems referred to the same person. One was my son. The other was a costume worn until it killed the man inside it. A week later, Detective Vega called with a final update. The case, at least the part that could be closed, was closing. They had enough to establish Stephen Varga's real identity through old fingerprints and prior records. There would be no prosecution, obviously. No confrontation, no explanation. The dead rarely offer the courtesy of motives. Before hanging up, she asked if there was anything else we needed. I almost said no. Instead, I asked the question that had sat like a stone in me from the beginning. Did he ever come here? There was a pause. We can't prove that, she said. But she did not say no. After that, I started noticing little things I would have dismissed before. A car idling too long near the cemetery road. A man in a baseball cap at the grocery store looking in my direction once too often. I knew, rationally, that grief and fear make patterns where there are none. But there was one fact I could not reason away. Stephen Varga had our old address, our current one, my maiden name, our church, our son's photographs. Somewhere, at some point, he had come close enough to gather them. That is what unsettles me most now, even more than the decades he lived as Daniel. Not the theft itself, but the proximity. The image I cannot get out of my mind is no longer the motel room, or the forged driver's license, or the stack of copied records. It is something quieter. A man sitting alone under bad light, opening a notebook, writing down my child's details, one by one. Looking at Daniel's face in those copied photographs, and deciding he could use him. People think the horror of identity theft is financial ruin, legal trouble, the difficulty of correcting records. And those things are horror enough. But that is not what this was. This was a stranger reaching into the worst day of our lives and building a future out of it. Daniel died in 1984. That should have been the end of what the world could take from him. It was not. The thing that still wakes me, even now, is not the police call itself. It is what came after, the discovery that for more than 30 years, another man moved through the country under my son's name, carrying a wallet that said he belonged to a life he had stolen. Married under it, worked under it, aged under it, failed under it, and in a cardboard box in a dead man's motel room, police found proof of what he had really been carrying all that time. Not just my son's identity. My son's childhood. My family's history. My maiden name. Our address. Our grief, studied line by line until he could step inside it. That is the part I cannot forgive, and the part I cannot forget. A person should be allowed to die only once. My son did not get that. Story 2. The system believed them first. My name is Stephen Harris, and the first time I tried to buy a car, I found out someone else had already wrecked my life with it. I was 20 years old, living in Dayton, Ohio, and still in that strange part of life where adulthood feels close enough to touch, but not fully yours yet. I was working full-time at a warehouse supply company on the edge of Moraine, unloading trucks, scanning inventory, and doing the kind of labor that leaves your back stiff before you are old enough to have earned it. It was not glamorous work, but it was steady, and for the first time in my life I had enough money saved that I felt like I was moving forward instead of just waiting to. The car was supposed to be part of that. Up until then, I'd been borrowing my dad's old Silverado when our schedules lined up, catching rides with friends, or using the bus when I had no other option. It made you feel younger than you were, standing outside before sunrise, waiting under a flickering shelter light, while other people drove past on their way to jobs and lives that looked more settled than yours. I wanted my own keys, my own payment book, my own little proof that I was becoming someone who could handle things. My dad, Mark Harris, was the kind of man who treated milestones like jobs that needed doing. He was never overly sentimental. He didn't give speeches. He just showed up early, brought paperwork in a manila folder, and made you feel like if you stayed calm, most things could be solved. He had worked 30 years in municipal maintenance, first for the county and then for the city, and he believed in prepared hands, clean records, and keeping every receipt. Even his glove compartment looked organized enough to pass inspection. He took a day off work to go with me to the dealership. It was a bright Thursday in March, cold in the shade and almost warm in the sun. We drove out to a used dealership on the north side of Dayton because they had a silver Toyota Corolla listed online that looked clean, low mileage, and just new enough not to feel like I was buying somebody else's problem. I remember the wind cutting through the rows of cars, making the little plastic pennants overhead snap and flutter. Salesmen moved between vehicles in quarter zips and polished shoes, smiling too hard and holding clipboards like they were already halfway through the deal. I was nervous, but it was good nervous, the kind that comes before something you've worked for. Dad had already told me how it would go. We'd test drive it, make sure the engine sounded right, let them run my information, and if the financing rate came back ugly, he would co-sign to help get it down. He'd done this before for my older cousin after his divorce, so he carried himself like somebody walking into a familiar process. I leaned on that. At 20, a lot of your confidence is really just borrowed from whoever drove you there. The test drive went fine. The Corolla smelled faintly of air freshener and old upholstery, but it ran smooth, brakes clean, no rattle I could hear. I tried not to grin too much when I was behind the wheel. Dad noticed anyway. "You like it," he said. "Yeah." "Then don't act like that in front of them. Makes you easier to charge." That made me laugh, which settled me down. Inside, the dealership was all glass, fluorescent light, and that stale coffee smell every sales office seems to have. A TV mounted in the corner was running cable news with the volume off. We sat at a desk while a finance guy named Greg asked for my license, my social security number, proof of employment, proof of residence. Standard stuff. He smiled the whole time, but it was the detached smile of somebody already thinking about the next customer. Dad sat next to me with his folder open, glasses low on his nose. Greg typed for a while, clicked through screens, then said, "This shouldn't take long." He got up and disappeared into a back office. I remember looking through the glass toward the lot, watching light move over the roofs of the cars. Somebody was inflating a balloon arch near the entrance for a weekend sale. It looked ridiculous in the wind, straining against its ties. 5 minutes later, Greg came back, and something had changed in his face. He was still smiling, technically, but it was tighter now, careful, the kind of smile people use when they think they're about to deal with dishonesty. He sat down slowly and said, "Stephen, I just want to clarify a few things." My stomach tightened. "Okay." He turned the monitor slightly, not enough for me to read, just enough to make the gesture feel official. "I'm seeing several delinquent accounts here," he said. "A charged-off credit card, 2 personal loans in default, and a prior vehicle repossession." I stared at him. Dad said, "What?" Greg looked at me, not at Dad. "Have you had any issues with missed payments before?" For a second, I honestly thought he had pulled someone else's file. "I've never had a credit card," I told him. He blinked once. "I've never had a loan either," I said. "I've never bought a car." Greg's expression did not soften. If anything, it hardened with professional caution. He had probably heard every lie people tell in offices like that. He probably heard them every day. "Okay," he said. "So if there's something inaccurate on the report, that would need to be addressed with the credit bureaus. But based on what's here, even with a co-signer, this application is going to have complications." Dad held out his hand. "Let me see it." Greg hesitated, then printed the report summary and slid it across the desk. Dad read it once, then again. His jaw shifted the way it did when he was trying not to lose his temper in public. The words on the page did not feel real to me at first. Delinquent revolving account, personal installment default, repossessed auto loan, collections, late payments, charge-offs. They were attached to my name, my date of birth, my social security number. It felt like looking at an autopsy report with your own information on it. "There's a mistake," I said. Greg spread his hands a little. "It happens sometimes," but the look he gave me said he did not think it happened this time. Dad pointed to the date on one of the oldest accounts. "This says it was open when he was 17. Greg said nothing. Dad tapped the paper harder. "He was in high school. He didn't even have a full-time job." Greg shifted in his chair. "If you believe the identity has been compromised, you'll need to file disputes and probably a police report." Probably, like he was talking about a cracked windshield. The whole meeting deteriorated after that. Nobody was openly rude, but the atmosphere changed in a way I could feel with painful clarity. The salesman who had chatted with us on the lot stopped making eye contact. Greg's tone became clipped and procedural. We were no longer father and son buying a first car. We were a problem at a desk, a risk, a bad file. Outside, the sun felt too bright. Dad didn't say much while we crossed the lot. He just unlocked the truck and got in. I climbed into the passenger seat with the credit report trembling in my hands. He waited until the doors shut. "Did you ever put your information in anything stupid online?" he asked. The question hit harder than he meant it to. "No." "You sure?" "Yes." He exhaled through his nose and rubbed one hand over his mouth. "I'm not blaming you," he said. "I'm asking because if somebody got your social, we need to know where." I don't know. And I didn't. That was the worst part. If I had done something careless, at least there would have been a point of origin, a hole to patch. But this felt older than that. Dirtier, like something had already been living under the floorboards while I was still thinking the house was clean. We drove back in silence. That night, Dad sat with me at the kitchen table while we pulled my free credit reports from all 3 bureaus. The table was scarred oak, with one corner darkened from an old iron burn, and by midnight it was covered in papers, printouts, legal pads, sticky notes, envelopes, and coffee gone cold. My mother, Denise, hovered in and out, worried but trying not to crowd us. She worked nights as a respiratory therapist and kept saying she had to sleep before her shift, but she stayed in the doorway longer than she meant to each time. The reports were worse than the dealership summary. There were accounts I'd never heard of. Department store credit cards. A secured card that had somehow turned into an unsecured line before going bad. 2 personal loans. A utility bill in collections from Indiana. An auto loan originating in Kentucky. Address histories in places I had never been. Columbus, Richmond, Lexington. A short-term lease in Toledo. One employer record tied to a packaging plant in Cincinnati I had never worked at. It was like reading the bad biography of someone wearing my skin. Dad kept writing things down in block letters. Accounts opened in November of 2021. Disputed accounts. Addresses that were not his. Police reports. Frozen accounts. He was calm, because he had made himself calm. I could see the anger sitting under it, like pressure in a sealed pipe. "Call them tomorrow," he said. "All of them. Bureau first, then the banks. Then, whoever held the car note." I was 17. I know. He had a car in my name before I even had one. Dad looked at me across the table, and I saw something in his face I had never seen before. Not just anger, and not pity either. Helplessness, maybe. The kind a father feels when a problem is too abstract to put his hands on. "They'll fix it," he said, but he sounded like a man trying to say it into existence. The next several months were the ugliest education of my life. Identity theft is never one thing. It is not one phone call, one report, one correction. It is a maze designed by people who assume systems are cleaner than they are. Every bank wanted an affidavit. Every bureau wanted proof. Every company wanted me to verify that I was myself by answering security questions based on a life I had never lived. Which county was associated with your auto loan in 2022? None. Which of the following streets have you lived on? None of them. What was the monthly payment amount on your installment account? I don't know, because it wasn't mine. The first police report took 3 hours because the officer at the desk treated me like a kid trying to talk his way out of debt. He was not openly hostile. That would almost have been easier. He was worse than that, tired and skeptical, glancing from me to Dad and back like he thought the truth was probably somewhere in the middle. "You're saying all of this is fraudulent," he said. "Yes." "And you never opened any of these accounts?" "No." "You understand filing a false report is a crime?" Dad leaned forward in his chair. You think he reposed a car at 19 for fun? The officer looked at him. I'm telling you what I have to tell everyone. That was another thing I learned. Every part of the process assumes the liar gets there first. The banks were worse. Most of them put me on hold long enough that songs and pre-recorded apologies began to feel hateful. I would explain the situation to one representative, get transferred, explain it again, get disconnected, call back, start over. Some sounded sympathetic. Some sounded annoyed. One woman at a lending company in Kentucky told me, "Well, sir, somebody using your social security number doesn't automatically mean you aren't responsible." As if I might be trying out a new excuse for the balance on a repossessed sedan. That repossession became the center of it all in my mind. I do not know why. Maybe because it should have been mine in a way the other accounts were not. A car is visible, tangible. You sit inside it. You hold the keys. Someone had driven under my name before I ever got to. They had missed payments under my name, ignored notices under my name, forced a tow truck to hook chains under a car paid for with my future. Dad started coming over after work with more folders. He made binders. One for bureau disputes, one for creditors, one for police reports and affidavits, one for account histories. He printed timelines. He bought a label maker. There was something heartbreaking about the seriousness he gave it. The way he treated my ruined credit, like a leaking foundation or storm damage. Something a man could maybe fix if he stayed organized enough. On Sundays, he would sit with me at the table and say, "All right, where are we at?" And I would tell him, "Equifax pending. TransUnion wants another copy of the report. Experian removed one account, but not the others. The utility collection is still there. The auto lender says the contract was validated. The card company wants identity verification again. The addresses are still showing. My score is still tanked." He would nod once, write it down, and say, "Then we keep going." I started dreading the mailbox. Thin envelopes from creditors, thick ones from bureaus, notices with windows on the front, certified letters. Every time I saw one with my name typed on it, something tightened in my chest. Some nights I lay awake imagining all the places that false version of me had already entered, all the databases it had touched. Employment screening, rental applications, background checks, insurance, maybe even criminal records if the next account holder was worse than the last. There is a kind of horror in realizing your name is no longer private enough to protect you. A lot of people talk about identity as if it's something internal, something no one can take unless you let them. That is not true. So much of who you are in modern life exists in systems you never see. Numbers, records, scores, histories, flags. Once those systems decide a version of you exists, you have to chase it through rooms you are not allowed to enter. I started noticing other changes too. Smaller ones, but not small to me. I stopped checking out online as fast because I didn't trust forms anymore. I stopped answering unknown numbers because every call felt like it might be another collector, another fraud department, another person asking me to explain why I was myself. At work, when one of the older guys joked about credit card debt, I laughed with everyone else, but I felt heat move up my neck so fast I had to step outside afterward. My future had developed a shadow. It got worse before it got better. About 6 weeks in, one of the personal loan companies sent back a packet with copies of the original application documents they claimed tied me to the debt. Dad and I opened it together at his kitchen table this time, because Mom was sleeping after a double shift, and he didn't want to wake her with cursing. The packet included signatures, income claims, an address in Lexington, and photocopies of supporting identification. My name was all over it. Stephen Harris. Date of birth, correct. Social security number, correct. The handwriting wasn't mine. The email wasn't mine. The phone number wasn't mine. But it did not matter at first glance. The page looked official enough to pass. Dad sat back in his chair, staring at the paperwork, as if concentration alone might burn through it. "He's older," he said suddenly. I looked at him. "What?" "The person who did this. Look at the income estimate. Look at the employment history. Look at the timing. This isn't another kid." He was right. I had been picturing some faceless young guy buying sneakers on a stolen card number. This was something else. Someone older. Someone practiced. Somebody patient enough to live inside a name and drag it along behind him from account to account. That idea unsettled me more than I can explain. He was out there somewhere, old enough to know exactly what he was doing, carrying my information in his wallet or his glove box or in some folded paper in his coat pocket, telling people my name in waiting rooms and offices, writing it on forms, hearing it called back to him, and not even flinching. Weeks after that, we finally got movement on the auto loan. The lender had resisted harder than anyone else because the debt was larger and the repossession had already been finalized years earlier. But after the police report, multiple affidavits, and pressure from a state consumer protection complaint Dad insisted we file, they agreed to send part of the repossession file for review. I remember the envelope because it was heavier than I expected. Dad waited until I got home from work to open it. We sat at the kitchen table again, the same place where this whole thing had spread out and taken over my life. Outside, it was raining, hard enough that water clicked against the windows and blurred the porch light. The house smelled like wet pavement and spaghetti sauce because Mom had just left for another night shift. Dad slid the documents out and spread them carefully. Tow report, notice of default, recovery receipt, auction intake sheet, then the lot photograph. It was grainy, printed in washed-out color, showing a dark gray sedan parked in a fenced impound lot under sodium lights. Rain or dew had collected on the hood. One headlight was cracked. There was a white grease pencil number scrawled across the windshield. It looked abandoned in the specific sad way only repossessed vehicles do, stripped of personhood, waiting to be priced as failure. I stared at it for a long time. "That was supposed to be my first car," I said quietly. Dad didn't answer. Tucked behind the tow report was a copy of the identification used when the loan was opened. It was a driver's license. My name, my date of birth, my number. My address at the time was wrong, but everything else that mattered was clean enough to get through. The photo was the part that truly broke something in me. The man staring out of that little laminated square was at least 40, maybe older, hollow-cheeked, thinning hair, eyes flat and tired, like somebody who had been living badly for a long time and gotten used to it. He looked nothing like me. Not in age, not in build, not in anything that should have survived more than a second of human review. And yet, he had been enough. Enough to open the loan, enough to take the car, enough to miss payments and lose it, enough to leave all of that rot attached to my name until I tried to begin my adult life and found the door already jammed shut. Dad picked up the copy and held it close to his face. "This should never have cleared," he said, but it had. That was the nightmare at the center of all of it. Not that the thief had been clever, not that he looked convincing, not that he had built some perfect false life. He hadn't. The paperwork was sloppy in places. The addresses shifted. The income numbers were inconsistent. The photograph alone should have stopped it cold. But the system had not been looking for truth. It had been looking for enough. And he had enough of me before I ever got the chance to become myself on paper. I wish I could say that once we had that photo, the rest moved quickly. It did not. Some accounts fell off after 90 days. Others took 6 months. One bureau corrected the repossession note, but left the payment history attached for another billing cycle. I learned terms I never wanted to know. Fraud alert, extended alert, consumer statement, furnisher investigation, secondary review, reinserted trade line. I also learned how much damage a false history can do before you ever see it. I got turned down for a store card I never wanted in the first place. My insurance quote came back higher. A property management company asked for an additional deposit on an apartment application because of credit concerns, before I withdrew it out of humiliation. The warehouse promoted a guy with less time than me into a logistics coordinator role, and while no one said it was because of my credit, the position involved company fuel cards and vehicle access. I couldn't stop wondering. It changes you, being treated like the aftermath of somebody else's decisions. By late fall, most of the fraudulent accounts were finally removed or blocked. My score started inching upward. Not fast, not enough, but upward. For Christmas, Dad gave me a simple leather folder embossed with my initials. Inside, he'd put copies of all the finalized dispute resolutions, a checklist of what to monitor going forward, and a handwritten note on lined paper. Not your mess, not your shame. Keep moving. I had to go into the garage for a minute after reading it, because I could feel tears coming, and my dad and I are both the kind of people who pretend not to notice that sort of thing when we can. It took until the following spring before I actually bought a car. Not the Corolla from that first day, obviously. That one had been sold within the week. The car I ended up with was older, darker, and less exciting. A blue Honda Civic with more miles than I wanted, but a clean title and a loan we secured through a local credit union after bringing in enough documentation to fill a banker's desk. Dad came with me again. Same manila folder system, same steady voice, same way of turning every conversation practical when he sensed I was getting overwhelmed. When they handed me the keys, I expected to feel triumph. Instead, I felt relief. That bothered me for a long time. A first car should feel like freedom. For me, it felt like regaining territory. I still think about that photograph sometimes, the one from the repossession file. The older man with my name under his face. I do not know where he is now, or if he is still doing it under somebody else's information. I do not know whether he ever thought about me as a real person. Maybe to him, I was just a useful sequence of numbers and letters, a clean shelf to dump his failures on until it sagged. But I know what he left behind. Not just debt, not just ruined credit, suspicion. That is the piece people do not talk about. Once this happens, every ordinary step into adulthood feels contaminated. Every form, every application, every system that asks you to identify yourself. There is always a second of waiting. A second where you wonder whether your own name will betray you again. I was 20 years old when I learned that someone can steal more than your money. They can get to your future first. They can stand in line where you were supposed to stand, sign where you were supposed to sign, drive what you were supposed to drive, and leave the wreckage sitting there for you like an inheritance. The worst part was never that a stranger used my identity. It was that when I finally stepped forward and said who I was, the system looked at both of us and believed him first. Story 3. In a moment, I lost it all. My name is Cam Sanders, and for most of my adult life, access was the thing I trusted. Access meant the badge on the lanyard around my neck. It meant the coded doors opening in sequence. It meant my credentials resolving properly in systems the public never saw. It meant that after years of school, years of screenings, years of interviews, background reviews, reinvestigations, and the constant quiet pressure of working close to violent death, I had made it into a world that did not let people in casually. I worked in Quantico, Virginia, in a federal forensic division that supported active investigations, including FBI homicide cases and major violent crime matters that crossed jurisdictions. My role sat in that unpleasant middle distance between laboratory work and field urgency. I was not the person kicking in doors or standing in front of cameras. I was one of the people behind the chain of custody, the evidence assessments, the pattern analysis, the quiet internal findings that had to be right because someone else's mistake could start a cascade that never stopped. I had spent 12 years building that life. Every promotion, every review, every clearance update had been earned the slow way. I was 34 when I learned how little any of that mattered once the system decided your name belonged to someone else. People hear security clearance and think of secrets first. They imagine hidden files, locked briefcases, black SUVs, things stamped and redacted. The reality is less cinematic and more invasive. Your finances matter. Your travel matters. Your record matters. What you owe, who you know, where you have been, whether you can be pressured, whether your life runs clean enough to be trusted around sensitive work. It is not enough to be competent. You have to be stable on paper. Mine was stable on paper. Or I thought it was. I lived alone in Stafford, about 30 minutes from Quantico when traffic was kind, and over an hour when it was not. My apartment was on the 3rd floor of a beige complex with the kind of carpeting every landlord seems to buy in bulk. Something low and gray, and determined to survive tenants rather than comfort them. My life was not exciting, but it was orderly. I had a government-issued vehicle for work, travel, and scene response. My personal finances were predictable. I paid my bills early, kept one credit card for daily use and one for emergencies, made coffee at home, rarely drank, and lived with the quiet discipline that jobs like mine train into you whether you want it or not. The morning it happened was a Tuesday in late November. Cold, clear, hard blue sky. The kind of Virginia morning where every sound feels sharper because the air is so thin and dry. I left my apartment before sunrise, carrying a travel mug of coffee and a hard-sided evidence review case I had brought home the previous night to prep notes for a task force briefing. There had been a homicide outside Albuquerque with interstate implications, and our division had been pulled in on cross-match trace findings. I was tired, but not unusually tired. Just normal case tired. The kind that settles behind your eyes and makes fluorescent light feel personal. I remember the frost on the edge of the windshield, the smell of heated plastic in the vehicle as it warmed, the radio low and meaningless. Everything about that drive was ordinary enough that I have gone back over it 100 times since, looking for some signal that the day had already turned against me. There was none. Quantico at that hour was all controlled motion. Vehicles entering in lines, people with badges and folders, security staff in layered jackets, breath visible in the cold, scanning the flow without seeming to. The facility where I worked sat behind two access points, one broad and visible, one narrower and quieter, reserved for personnel whose credentials cleared them beyond the first ring. I had passed through those doors so many times that my body moved before I thought. Park, collect case, badge out, nod to the guard, swipe, wait for the soft click. Only that morning, there was no click. The reader flashed red. Access denied. For a second, I just stared at it. I assumed I had angled the badge wrong, or swiped too quickly, or still had it pressed against my coat instead of clear of the fabric. I adjusted it and tried again. Red. Access denied. The guard at the desk, a man named Heller I had seen for years without ever really knowing, looked up. Try it once more, he said. I did. Read again. That was the first moment something inside me shifted. Not panic. Not yet. More like the floor inside the moment-changing material, becoming less stable. My badge had never not worked. These systems glitched, sure, but not often, and not usually like that. No partial lag. No delay. Just immediate refusal, as if I had never belonged there. Heller stood. He was trying to keep his expression neutral, but I saw the alertness enter his posture. Hold on a second, miss. Sanders. He spoke into the desk phone quietly, gave my name and badge number, then looked at me in a way I had never seen before. Not familiar, not exactly suspicious, but no longer routine. I was now an irregularity, and everyone in a place like that knows irregularities move upward fast. Can you step to the side for me, please? The corridor beyond the entrance was bright with that particular clean institutional lighting that makes everyone look a little drained. Behind me, other employees kept arriving. Some glanced over, most did not. In secure buildings, people learn early not to stare at anything that looks procedural. I stepped aside and stood there holding my case and travel mug like an idiot, while two internal security officers came down from the next checkpoint. One of them I recognized by sight, a woman named Shu. The other I had never seen before. Both were polite. Both were already close to me in a way I understood immediately. Miss Sanders, Shu said, we need you to come with us. What's going on? There's an administrative issue with your access. What kind of issue? We'll explain inside. Inside, but not where I was supposed to go. They took me not into the building proper, but into a secondary interview room off the administrative corridor, windowless except for a narrow strip of reinforced glass facing a blank hall wall. There was a table, 3 chairs, a tissue box, and a vent that hissed cold air with enough force to make the room feel smaller. I set the evidence case on the table and kept hold of my coffee because suddenly I did not know what else to do with my hands. 2 more people joined us within minutes. One was from internal security compliance. The other introduced himself as a representative from personnel oversight. No one sat fully relaxed. No one spoke casually. The air in the room changed from inconvenience to event. Cam, the personnel man said, glancing at a file folder in front of him. Your clearance has been temporarily suspended, pending review. I actually thought I had misheard him. My what? Your clearance has been suspended pending review. I laughed once, short and sharp, because it sounded too absurd to be true. No, I said. There's a mistake. He folded his hands. A matter has arisen involving identity verification and criminal record conflict. I felt cold move up through me in a way that had nothing to do with the vent. What criminal record? He slid a single printed sheet across the table. At the top was my name. Cameron Elise Sanders, my date of birth. Then a booking reference from New Mexico tied to felony narcotics distribution and possession with intent. Arrest date, 3 days earlier. Detention, hold. Identity established under my name. I looked up so quickly the room blurred. That's not me. We understand that is your statement. My statement? The internal security woman spoke next, calm and careful. An individual arrested in New Mexico provided identifying information that matched you. That matched me how? Name, date of birth, social security number, and prior address association. I stared at her. I have never been arrested in New Mexico. I have barely been to New Mexico. Nobody answered. Or rather, they answered with the look bureaucracies wear when they are already downstream from something and can no longer afford emotion. It was not that they believed I was guilty. It was worse than that. They believed the process had to proceed before belief mattered. Until this is resolved, the personnel man said, your access to all classified and restricted systems is suspended. Your credentials are inactive. Your government-issued vehicle privileges are revoked. Your network permissions are frozen. You are also being placed on immediate administrative leave. There are moments when the human mind cannot process the full size of what is being said, so it picks one small piece to hold instead. Mine was the vehicle. Maybe because it was tangible. Maybe because I had driven it there that morning. Maybe because the rest, access, systems, permissions, leave, all sounded like language from a training module until he said something I could picture. You're taking my vehicle. It is government property, he said. It has case materials in it. We'll retrieve and inventory everything. I could feel my pulse in my teeth. This is insane, I said. You know me. I work here. Shu finally met my eyes fully, and there was something almost sympathetic there, which made it worse. Right now, she said, we need you to surrender your badge. I did not move. Then very slowly, I unclipped it and placed it on the table. It made a tiny plastic sound when it landed. In a building like that, losing your badge is not symbolic, it is anatomical. It is a piece of yourself being recognized as no longer functional. They escorted me out, through a side corridor after that. Not handcuffed, not publicly humiliated, nothing theatrical, just quietly removed. The sort of quiet removal that tells you this place knows how to make people disappear from it with practice. At the vehicle lot, a compliance officer took the government SUV keys from my hand, logged the mileage, and opened the back compartment to begin inventory. I stood on the pavement with my purse, my coffee gone cold, and my personal phone in my coat pocket, while my work life was dismantled around me, like I had already died inside it. I called my supervisor first. He did not answer. I called again. This time he picked up but sounded like a man already, speaking from a distance he had no intention of crossing. Cam, what the hell is happening? I can't discuss the details outside official process. It's not me. There was a pause. I understand that's what you're saying. The wording struck me like something physical. That's what I'm saying? Alan, you know it's not me. Another pause. Thinner now. Until the review is complete, you need to cooperate fully. Then he hung up. I stood in the parking lot staring at my own reflection in the dark window of the vehicle they had just taken from me. I looked like myself, hair pinned up badly, dark wool coat, the beginning of fatigue around my eyes. No visible sign that in less than an hour I had become administratively unstable. I called my bank next because some animal part of me understood before the rest of me did that when one system flags you, others follow. I was right. After the first verification layer, the representative put me on hold. When she returned, her voice had shifted. Miss Sanders, I'm seeing a security hold on your primary checking and savings accounts pending fraud review. I sat down on the curb. What do you mean hold? They are temporarily restricted. For how long? I am unable to provide a timeline. My rent comes out tomorrow. I'm sorry, ma'am. My credit card was next. Restricted. The secondary card. Restricted. A fraud division representative used the phrase cascading risk response, which sounded like something out of a disaster manual. By 11 that morning, I no longer had workplace access, network access, vehicle access, or normal access to my own money. There is a particular kind of fear that comes when your life does not explode. It simply closes, door after door, account after account. No flames, no screaming. Just one system after another deciding you are not currently valid. I drove home in a rideshare because the government vehicle had been taken, and my own car was at the mechanic for brake work. The driver kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror because I must have looked strange, too formally dressed for the middle of the day, sitting rigid and pale and staring at nothing. Outside the windows, Virginia kept behaving normally. School zones, gas stations, construction cones, people buying coffee and crossing parking lots. It offended me how ordinary everything looked. At my apartment, I locked the door behind me and stood in the kitchen without taking my coat off. Then I did what everyone tells you to do when the impossible happens. I started making calls. Internal review office, no timeline, clearance, adjudication, liaison, pending verification, fraud departments, submit police report, credit bureaus, place freeze. New Mexico, detention records, no disclosure without formal request. Human resources, administrative leave with review status attached. My private insurance provider. Policy temporarily flagged pending identity discrepancy. The phrase identity discrepancy entered my life before noon and made me hate language on contact. By 3 in the afternoon, my dining table was covered in notepads, forms, copied ID, old tax records, apartment lease printouts, and every document I could think of that proved the continuity of my life. College records, employment records, passport, utility statements. My original birth certificate still held flat in the envelope my mother had once used to store family documents. I lined them up the way I used to line up evidence packets before review, because structure was the only thing keeping me from collapsing. I called my younger brother, Noah, around 4. He lives in Richmond and usually answers the phone, sounding halfway amused, no matter what the situation is. Not that day. He heard my voice and immediately stopped trying to sound normal. What happened? When I told him, he said, "I'm coming up." "You don't have to. I'm already getting my keys." He arrived an hour later with takeout containers and the stunned anger of someone who loves you enough to be sad. Outraged before he understands the full shape of the problem. Noah is 31, broad-shouldered, easier with people than I have ever been, and still carries a little of the protective instinct he developed as the younger sibling who grew into someone physically larger than me before either of us noticed. He sat at my table reading the printed booking summary and went dead quiet halfway through. "She used your social too?" "Yes." "How does that even happen?" I looked around at the paperwork. "That's what I'm trying to find out." The first concrete answer came the next day, though answer is too generous a word for something so bleak. A liaison from the New Mexico agency handling the arrest would not give me full documents yet, but after enough calls routed through enough federal contacts, she confirmed that the woman arrested under my identity had used my name during booking and during at least 2 earlier encounters in neighboring jurisdictions. There were prior work records attached under my name as well, enough to create a dirty continuity that systems love, because systems are built to reward consistency more than truth. "How long?" I asked. "Potentially over 2 years, she said. 2 years. For 2 years, someone had been moving under my identity while I passed periodic internal reviews, salary direct deposits, tax filings, and federal updates without any obvious collision. That was the worst part of it. Not just that she had used my name, but that she had used it long enough to settle into it. Noah found me staring at the wall after that call. "You okay?" "No," I said. "I don't know where she ends, and I begin in the record anymore." That is not dramatic language. It is literally what it felt like. Every secure life is partly built from invisible confirmations. Yes, this person is who she says she is. Yes, this account belongs to her. Yes, this employment history is hers. Yes, this record connects cleanly to prior records. Once a second version of you enters those channels and stays there long enough, the system does not experience it as invasion. It experiences it as expansion. Then it begins asking which of the two is irregular, and the answer is whichever one got reviewed second. By the 3rd day, word had spread enough inside my division that people stopped reaching out casually. A few texted, short, careful messages. "Thinking of you. Hope this gets resolved. Let me know if you need anything." No one called to talk the way they would have if I had been hit by a car or lost a parent. Criminal identity contamination creates a different kind of distance. People do not know whether to treat you as victim, risk, or rumor. I got one call from Alan, my supervisor, on Friday evening. "Internal review wants a full chronology of your last 12 months, he said. "Of my actual life?" "Yes." I laughed once because I couldn't help it. He did not. I also need to ask whether there's any possibility someone close to you had access to your personal documents. No. A former partner, roommate, family member? No. There was a silence on the line that told me he was entering my answers somewhere. Alan, I said, do you believe me? He took too long. I believe the process will determine what it determines. I ended the call before I said something I would regret. Noah stayed through the weekend. We worked the problem like a storm response. Credit freezes. Police report in Virginia. Affidavits. Complaint submissions. Contact logs. We ordered certified copies of everything. We mapped timelines. He drove me to the mechanic to get my own car back because I could not risk another rideshare bill with my accounts restricted. We went grocery shopping with cash. He insisted on fronting me because my debit card kept failing in ways that drew too much attention. The first time it was declined, at a self-checkout under white light while I was buying eggs and detergent, I felt such a sharp rush of humiliation that I had to put one hand on the bagging area to steady myself. The screen flashed transaction unavailable, and the woman supervising the lanes wandered over with the bland patience of retail employees who have seen every possible human inconvenience. Need to try another card? She asked. I heard myself say, there's been a mistake. She nodded as if that explained everything. I paid with Noah's cash and sat in the car afterward, staring through the windshield at shopping carts knocked together under a gray sky, thinking how fast a person can become administratively homeless without moving an inch. The full arrest packet reached me a week later through restricted channels and lawyered requests. I was allowed to review parts of it in a federal office under supervision, which felt almost funny in a way that was too bitter to enjoy. I needed permission to look at the paperwork that was destroying me. The packet was thick. Booking summary, prior aliases, intake notes, employment references, address links, mugshot, property inventory, cross-jurisdictional queries. Most of the pages were ugly in the ordinary bureaucratic way, dense fields and coded entries and signatures from people who had no idea what their routine processing was detonating elsewhere. Then I turned the page and saw her. The booking photo was clipped to the upper right corner of the summary sheet. A stranger, 40s, maybe, hard face, hair dragged back carelessly, mouth set in a flat line that looked less afraid than irritated. There was a bruise near her temple, and the washed-out look of someone who had lived too long under fluorescent light and bad choices. Beneath the photo, typed cleanly and without emotion, was my name. Cameron Elise Sanders, my date of birth, my identifying numbers. My life compressed into fields she had stepped into as if they were empty. I remember gripping the edge of the table so hard my fingers hurt later. The official in the room asked, "Do you need a moment?" I almost said no. Then I heard my own voice answer, "Yes." I went into the restroom down the hall and locked myself in the farthest stall like a child. Not because I was crying, though I was close, but because I needed walls around me for a minute. Everything in that building smelled like soap and climate control and copy paper. It reminded me too much of work, too much of all the rooms where I had been competent and trusted. When I came back, the official had turned to another page showing prior employment entries linked to the same identity trail. A motel in Arizona, a distribution center in Nevada, a diner outside Gallup, different addresses, different phone numbers, my name steady through all of it. "How does this happen for 2 years?" I asked. He gave the only honest answer anyone had managed so far. Long enough use creates record confidence. Record confidence. A life can be destroyed by phrases like that. By the second week, my apartment started feeling unfamiliar to me. Not because anything had changed physically, but because the systems that used to stabilize the edges of my life were gone or uncertain. My work laptop had been confiscated. My credentials were dead. My accounts functioned only in fragments. Mail felt threatening. Email felt worse. Even the government SUV, no longer being in its usual spot, had changed the visual rhythm of my mornings enough to make the whole parking lot look wrong. I began waking up at 3 or 4 and listening for noises in the hallway outside my apartment door. Not because I thought the woman would come. I did not even know if she knew I existed beyond my data. But identity theft alters your sense of perimeter. If someone can live inside your information, then the distance between stranger and self no longer feels reliable. Noah eventually had to go back to work. Before he left, he stood in my kitchen with his keys in one hand and said, "You call me the second anything changes." "I will." "And Cam?" Yeah? This is not your fault. I nodded because he needed me to. But fault had stopped mattering. The damage was already procedural, institutional, automatic. It took nearly a month before the first internal clearance review softened enough to allow for provisional reconsideration. Not reinstatement, not apology. Reconsideration. By then I had burned through savings, borrowed money from Noah for rent coverage, while my accounts untangled, and learned exactly how quickly colleagues turn into careful witnesses when your file goes dirty. When I was finally allowed back into a federal office for a formal identity resolution interview, I wore the same navy blouse I usually saved for testimony support meetings, because I wanted at least one part of me to feel like the old version. The room was larger than the first one, but no less cold. A review officer asked me to account for my whereabouts on dates connected to the arrest record. Dates I could refute easily because I had been in Virginia, working, clocked, observed, digitally present in official systems. The proof existed. It had always existed. But that was not enough to prevent the collapse. It was only enough to begin rebuilding afterward. That is the truth people do not understand until it happens to them. Evidence helps, eventually. Eventually is not the same thing as in time. By the point the process finally started bending back toward me, the damage had already entered everything. My supervisor's trust, even if he claimed otherwise. My division's perception, my finances, my own nervous system. I had learned what it felt like to watch the architecture of a life respond to a false version of you faster than it ever responded to the real one. Months later, after partial reinstatement, after account corrections, after meetings nobody ever apologized in, I found my old badge lanyard in the back of a drawer at home. They had returned it during one of the reprocessing stages, but without the badge attached, it looked pathetic. Just a strip of blue fabric and a plastic clip with nothing meaningful to hold. I stood there in my bedroom turning it over in my hands and thinking about that first red flash at the reader, the tiny delay before I understood I was no longer being recognized. In a moment, I lost it all. That is the simplest way to say it, but it is not exact. The truth is more frightening than that. I did not lose it all in a moment. The moment only revealed that someone else had been slowly taking pieces of my name long before I knew to defend it, and that every system I trusted was prepared to react to her before it ever listened to me. That is what stayed with me. Not the mugshot. Not the suspension letter. Not even the sight of my own information typed beneath a stranger's face. It was the speed with which doors locked, the speed with which accounts froze, the speed with which people stepped back, the speed with which the false version of me was processed as urgent, and the real one became paperwork. I used to think horror was something dramatic, something bloody, something that announced itself clearly. It is not. Sometimes it is a badge reader turning red at 7 in the morning. Sometimes it is a man you have worked beside for years saying, "I understand that's what you're saying." Sometimes it is sitting in a parked car with groceries in the trunk and a declined card in your hand, understanding that your own life is now conditional. And sometimes it is realizing that in the systems you built your future around, identity is not who you are. It is whoever gets entered first, cleanly enough, and left there long enough to be believed. You have reached the end of the record, the point where the calls stop coming, the documents are laid out, and the life that once felt stable begins to feel far more fragile in memory than it did while it was unfolding. A death certificate, a credit report, a security badge denied at the door, framed by routine, trust, and the assumption that if your name is entered correctly, the system will still know who you are. But if anything followed you out of these stories, if any image stayed with you longer than it should have, it is because the horror was not only in the stolen identity. It was in the realization of what that identity was actually taken from. A mother named Elaine Simmons, living quietly in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, until police contact her in 2024 to report that a deceased man has been identified as her son Daniel, forcing her to relive the loss of a child who died in 1984 and confront the unbearable truth that someone else built an entire adulthood under his name. A 20-year-old named Stephen Harris walking into a dealership in Dayton, Ohio, expecting to buy his first car with his father Mark by his side, only to find that loans, charge-offs, and even a repossessed vehicle have already been attached to his identity by a stranger who reached his future before he did. And a forensic specialist named Cam Sanders, arriving for work in Quantico, Virginia, expecting another controlled morning inside a high-security federal system, until one denied badge scan, one criminal booking in another state, and one false version of her name begins shutting down every part of the life she spent years building. Because the most disturbing identity theft horror stories are not always about stolen money. Sometimes they are about stolen grief. Sometimes they are about stolen beginnings. And sometimes they begin with the simple belief that a record still belongs to the person it was meant to protect. We are taught to trust documentation, a signature, a driver's license, a date of birth, a file that comes back under the correct name. But recognition is not safety. The records can remain organized, the systems can remain calm, the name can still look correct, and something irreversible can still be living underneath it. So if you take anything from tonight, let it be this. Do not confuse a name with protection. Do not confuse a clean file with control. And do not assume your life is secure just because the system appears official when you first see it. Because sometimes the worst violations do not arrive by force. Sometimes they settle in quietly, one account, one record, one identity at a time, until the real person is the one left trying to prove they belong there. A dead child whose name should have been left untouched. A young man whose adult life was damaged before it began. A federal investigator whose entire future was suspended in a single morning. Subscribe if you want more stories like this. Stories about familiar systems, everyday routines, and the exact moment an ordinary life begins slipping out of someone's control in ways they do not understand fast enough. Let me know in the comments which story stayed with you the longest. Elaine Simmons and the man who died under Daniel's name. Stephen Harris at the dealership where his future came back, already ruined. Or Cam Sanders at the secure door that no longer recognized her. If you have your own experience, an account that was never yours, a record that came back wrong, or a moment where the system insisted on a version of you that did not exist, you can always share it. The business email is in the channel bio. Thank you for listening. Thank you for staying with the quiet dread inside the paperwork. And until next time, check the record, trust what feels wrong, and remember, the most terrifying thefts are not always the ones that take money. And remember, the dark awaits.